A flight attendant kicks a man off a plane thinking he's just another regular passenger. But 5 minutes later, she realizes the shocking truth about who he really is. What happens next will turn everything upside down. Don't blink or you'll miss the twist. Before we start the story, comment below and tell me where you're watching from. And if you like the story, make sure to hit that subscribe button. The plane was packed, and the air was thick with the hum of excited passengers. Everyone was settling into their seats, getting comfortable for the long flight ahead. The usual buzz of conversations filled the cabin as flight attendants moved up and down the aisle, helping people with their overhead bags and ensuring everyone had their seatbelts on. Among the crowd of passengers, one man stood out. He wasn't wearing anything fancy, just a simple black hoodie, jeans, and sneakers. But if you looked closely, there was something different about him. He had an air of quiet confidence, almost as if he didn't need to try hard to fit in. Little did anyone know, this man was worth billions, the kind of money most people could only dream of. But none of that mattered as he boarded the flight. To the flight attendants and the passengers around him, he was just another face in the crowd. As the man made his way to his seat in business class, he barely drew a second glance. His casual appearance didn't give off the vibe of someone important, especially not in a section full of well-dressed businessmen and women. He took his seat by the window, pulled out his phone, and stared at the screen, lost in thought. The flight attendants continued their usual routine, checking tickets and preparing for takeoff. One of the attendants, a young woman with dark hair tied back in a neat bun, paused as she saw the man sitting in his seat. She double-checked her list of passengers for the row he was in, then gave a quick glance at the man. There was something about him that didn't sit right with her. Something about his look didn't seem to belong in the front of the plane. She walked past him without saying a word, but her eyes lingered for a moment. Something felt off, and she couldn't shake the feeling. As she moved down the aisle, she glanced back at him again. He was still sitting there, calmly scrolling through his phone, oblivious to the growing unease in her mind. The flight attendant wasn't sure why, but she felt that the man simply didn't belong there. Maybe it was his casual clothes, or maybe it was just the way he carried himself, as though he didn't need to prove anything to anyone. Whatever it was, she couldn't help but feel that something wasn't right. A few minutes later, the plane took off, and the routine of the flight resumed. The seatbelt sign was turned off, and the passengers began to relax. The flight attendant who had noticed the man earlier went about her duties, offering drinks and snacks to passengers. But as she made her way back toward the front of the plane, she stopped again when she saw him. He was still sitting there, relaxed, as though he were completely unaware of the discomfort he had caused her. Something about his presence was starting to irritate her, even though she couldn't explain why. The other flight attendants were busy, and no one seemed to be paying any attention to the man. But the young attendant couldn't let it go. After a few minutes of hesitating, she made up her mind. She walked up to the man's seat, took a deep breath, and leaned over with a polite but firm expression. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice steady but with an edge. "I'm afraid you'll need to move to the back of the plane. This seat is reserved for someone else." The man looked up from his phone, clearly surprised. He blinked a few times as though trying to make sense of what she was saying. "I'm sorry," he asked, his voice calm but with a hint of confusion. "I'm afraid this seat isn't yours," she repeated, her voice a little more forceful now. "You'll have to move to the back where there are available seats." He sat there for a moment, taken aback by her request. He looked around the cabin, noticing that people were starting to notice the exchange. He didn't know what had triggered her to speak to him this way, but he wasn't about to make a scene. "I don't think I'm in the wrong seat," he said, trying to stay calm. The flight attendant's expression hardened. "I'm sorry, sir, but I must insist. Please move now, or I'll have to ask the captain to assist you." The billionaire couldn't believe what was happening. 1,000 thoughts ran through his mind, but he didn't want to escalate the situation. Instead, he reluctantly stood up, grabbing his bag and slowly walking down the aisle toward the back of the plane, trying to avoid the stares of the other passengers. It was a humiliating experience, but he kept his composure. As he walked down the aisle, He couldn't help but wonder why she had singled him out. It wasn't until he reached the back of the plane, slumping into a seat with a sigh, that he realized the truth. This wasn't about him being in the wrong seat. It was about something else entirely. But he couldn't quite figure out what it was. Not yet. Minutes passed, and the billionaire tried to settle into the cramped seat at the back of the plane. He glanced around, his mind racing with confusion. What had just happened? He wasn't sure why the flight attendant had insisted he move, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Was it his appearance? Did she think he was some kind of imposter? He couldn't understand why she hadn't even asked for his ticket or tried to verify his seat. Instead, she had just assumed he didn't belong up front. As the plane leveled out and the seatbelt sign turned off, he tried to relax. The situation was embarrassing, but he was used to dealing with awkward moments. However, the more he thought about it, the more frustrated he became. Who was she to make him feel so small, so out of place? He had flown first class countless times and never been treated this way. Was it just a mistake? Or was it something deeper? Meanwhile, at the front of the plane, the flight attendant who had asked him to move was quietly speaking with another crew member, her voice tense. She glanced nervously toward the back of the plane, where the man had moved to his new seat. The expression on her face had changed. The confidence she had when she first addressed him was now gone, replaced by a look of unease. Something about the whole situation didn't sit right with her either. A few minutes later, she found herself walking toward the back of the plane, her steps quick and purposeful. As she reached the aisle near his new seat, she caught sight of the man again. Her face turned pale as she realized who he was. It hit her like a ton of bricks. The man she had just kicked off was no ordinary passenger. He was the CEO of one of the biggest tech companies in the world. She had made a huge mistake. Her heart sank as she stood there, frozen in shock. How could she have been so blind? How could she have treated someone like that? And how could she have made such a poor judgment call in front of so many people? The flight attendant stood frozen for a moment, her mind racing. She could barely believe what she had just realized. The man sitting at the back of the plane wasn't just any random passenger. He was a billionaire, one of the most powerful tech moguls in the world. She had seen his picture before, on magazines, in business articles, but never in person. And now, she had forced him to move to the back, like some common traveler. Her face flushed with embarrassment as she gathered her thoughts. She had to fix this. There was no way she could leave things like this. Her heart was pounding in her chest, but she forced herself to walk toward him, trying to appear calm, though everything inside her was in turmoil. She couldn't stop thinking about what she had done. The billionaire looked up from his seat as she approached, his eyes narrowing slightly. He probably thought she was coming to reprimand him again. But this time, the flight attendant wasn't there to tell him to move. She was there to apologize. "Excuse me, sir," she said, trying to steady her voice. "I need to speak with you for a moment." The billionaire raised an eyebrow but didn't say anything. He had no idea what was coming. She hesitated for a second, her hands trembling slightly as she spoke. I made a mistake. You're actually in the right seat. I'm so sorry for the confusion earlier." The man didn't respond immediately. He just stared at her for a moment, clearly not expecting an apology. His expression was calm, but his eyes seemed to carry a weight of disbelief. "You're the one who asked me to move?" he asked, his voice low, still trying to process everything that had happened. The flight attendant nodded, her face flushed. "Yes, I did. And I'm so sorry. I didn't realize who you were, and I made a terrible judgment. You should never have been treated like that." The billionaire sat up straighter in his seat, his eyes narrowing as he processed her words. There was no anger in his voice, but there was something else, something sharper. "You didn't recognize me?" he asked, his tone cool. She shook her head, feeling small under his gaze. "I didn't. I thought you were just a regular passenger who had gotten confused. I didn't mean any harm, but I see now how wrong I was." The tension between them was thick, but the billionaire remained quiet for a moment, as if deciding how to respond. He glanced around the plane, catching a few curious stares from the other passengers, who were now clearly aware of what was happening. He took a deep breath, then looked back at her. "It's all right. You made a mistake. But maybe next time you should ask before assuming." The flight attendant nodded, her face still burning with embarrassment. She wanted to apologize more, to say that she hadn't meant to cause any harm, but she knew there was nothing more she could say. The damage had been done. She could only hope he would accept her apology and let it go. Just as the flight attendant began to turn away, the situation took an unexpected turn. The billionaire, still sitting in his new seat at the back of the plane, was suddenly interrupted by a voice overhead. The captain's voice crackled through the intercom, calm and professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a small adjustment to make. Please remain in your seats while we sort a few things out." The flight attendant paused, confused. Why was the captain getting involved? She had already apologized and the situation seemed to be settling. But moments later, a second flight attendant, the head of the crew, walked briskly toward the back of the plane. She had a serious look on her face, her eyes scanning the aisle before locking onto the flight attendant who had made the earlier mistake. Without a word, the head flight attendant motioned for her to follow. The younger attendant walked quickly behind her, heart pounding. What was going on now? Had something happened? They moved toward the rear galley, where the head attendant leaned in close. "Do you know who that man is?" the head attendant asked, her voice low but urgent. The younger flight attendant blinked, not understanding. I thought he was just a regular passenger." "Why?" The head attendant looked at her in disbelief. "That man you asked to move? He's Richard Lawson, the CEO of Lawson Tech. He's one of the wealthiest men in the world. He's literally a billionaire. He owns half of Silicon Valley. And you just made him move to the back like he was nobody." The younger attendant stood there in shock, her mouth going dry. "Wait, what?" she whispered. "But he didn't look like anyone special." The head attendant took a deep breath, her frustration apparent. "Appearances can be deceiving, but that's not the point. You didn't recognize him, and that's what matters. We can't just treat people like that. You could have ruined everything for the airline, and worse, for him." The younger attendant's stomach dropped as she realized the full extent of her mistake. It wasn't just about kicking a wealthy man off the plane. It was about her inability to see beyond surface-level judgments. She hadn't bothered to question why someone might be dressed casually. She hadn't even thought to check his ticket or identity. She had made an assumption and acted on it, and now she had to face the consequences. Back at the front of the plane, the billionaire was still sitting in his seat, silently processing the bizarre chain of events. His mind wandered for a moment, thinking about how easily people dismissed him based on his appearance. He had dealt with this kind of thing before. People assuming that because he didn't look flashy, he didn't belong. But this had gone a step too far. As he sat back in his seat, he reflected on the flight attendant's reaction. He could tell she was genuinely embarrassed, but it was clear she hadn't recognized him at first. It wasn't often that someone got so visibly flustered in his presence, especially not because of a simple mistake. He half expected her to come back and try to make things right, but for some reason, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite finished yet. He still had the nagging sense that there was more to this than just a misplaced seat. Minutes passed, and the tension in the air seemed to grow thicker. The flight attendants moved around with purpose, but the younger attendant could barely focus on her tasks. She kept glancing back toward the rear of the plane, hoping to catch another glimpse of the billionaire. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had messed up in a way that could cost her more than just an apology. She was certain that he knew who she was by now, and the thought made her stomach churn. She tried to keep herself busy, offering drinks to the passengers in first class, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the man in the back. She couldn't understand why she had let herself make such a rash judgment. What if he told the captain or the airline about her mistake? What if this became something bigger than she could fix? Meanwhile, at the back of the plane, the billionaire continued to sit quietly. He could feel the eyes of the other passengers on him, some of them awkwardly pretending not to notice the scene unfolding. He glanced around, noticing how the energy in the cabin seemed to shift. People were whispering now, no doubt gossiping about the incident. He sighed, his mind still buzzing with frustration, but also with curiosity. Why had she made that decision? Why had she assumed he didn't belong in business class? His mind raced with the possibilities, but a part of him couldn't help but feel a sense of amusement. People often underestimated him based on his appearance, and it seemed that this flight attendant had fallen right into that trap. It wasn't long before the head flight attendant approached him, looking more anxious than before. She stood at the edge of the aisle, her expression tight but apologetic. This wasn't just about making amends anymore. It was about damage control. "Mr. Lawson," she began, her voice respectful but with an edge of nervousness. "I'd like to offer my sincerest apologies for the misunderstanding earlier. There's been a bit of confusion, and I want to assure you that this was an isolated incident. It will not happen again." The billionaire glanced up at her, his expression still calm, but his eyes colder now. He had been waiting for this moment, though he hadn't expected it to come so soon. He had already made peace with the fact that things had spiraled out of control. He didn't want to make the situation worse, but the damage had already been done. "I appreciate the apology," he said slowly, his tone even. "But I think it's important that people understand that how we treat others matters, whether they're wearing a suit or a hoodie. What happened today goes beyond just a seating mix-up." The head attendant nodded quickly, her face flushing with embarrassment. "Of course, Mr. Lawson, I completely agree. We'll make sure this doesn't happen again, and we're taking full responsibility for the error." The billionaire didn't respond immediately. Instead, he leaned back in his seat and gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head. It wasn't the apology he was after, but he could see that they were genuinely trying to fix the situation. Still, there was something unsettling about how easily the mistake had been made in the first place. As he sat there, he wondered just how many people had made similar assumptions about him, about his worth, his status, his abilities, just because of how he dressed or carried himself, and how many had missed the chance to see him for who he truly was. This wasn't just about the flight attendant anymore. It was a reminder of how easy it was to judge someone based on nothing but a glance. The flight attendant stood there for a few more seconds, waiting for him to speak again, but the billionaire only nodded, dismissing her quietly. He was done talking about it. The apology had been given, and now the next part of the journey would continue. But as the plane hummed along, the incident lingered in the back of his mind, a reminder that appearances could be deceiving, and sometimes the biggest mistakes were made when people didn't bother to look deeper. The rest of the flight passed in an uneasy silence. The billionaire sat in his seat, staring out the window, lost in thought. He wasn't angry anymore, just tired. Tired of people making assumptions about him, tired of constantly having to prove his worth. He had worked hard to get where he was, but it always seemed like people saw him as just another face in the crowd, and that bothered him more than he cared to admit. The flight attendants went about their duties, but the younger attendant kept her distance. She didn't dare approach him again, even though she wanted to apologize more, to explain that she hadn't meant to offend him. But she knew that the damage was already done. She had made a mistake, and now she had to live with it. It wasn't just about the mistake itself, but the fact that she had judged him based on how he looked. In her mind, she had already written him off as someone who didn't belong in business class, someone who wasn't important enough to be there, and she had acted on that judgment without a second thought. As she moved through the cabin, offering snacks and drinks to the passengers, she couldn't stop thinking about him. She had seen his name on the manifest just moments before, but by then, it was too late. She knew now who he was, the man who had quietly built a billion-dollar empire, and the one she had just humiliated in front of the entire plane. Her face flushed with shame every time she glanced in his direction, but she couldn't avoid it. The truth was, she had learned the hard way that appearances didn't mean anything. People weren't always what they seemed. And in this case, her quick judgment had cost her more than she could have imagined. The billionaire, meanwhile, had stopped paying attention to her. He wasn't one to hold grudges, especially over something so trivial. But the incident had been a reminder of how easily people were overlooked or misjudged, especially those who didn't fit the mold others expected them to. It wasn't about the flight attendant or even the mix-up. It was about the bigger picture. How many times had he been dismissed in the past? How many times had people assumed he was just another average guy because he didn't walk into a room wearing a tailored suit and carrying the right brand of briefcase? He wasn't naive. He knew that people saw him and thought they had him figured out. But that was the thing about appearances. They could be deceiving. He had learned long ago not to care what others thought of him. But moments like this reminded him that the world was quick to judge. And sometimes, those judgments were far from accurate. As the plane began its descent, the younger flight attendant returned to the back of the cabin one last time. She couldn't bring herself to look him in the eye. Instead, she kept her gaze on the aisle, focusing on the small tasks she had left to do. She had been hoping for the chance to make things right, but now it felt too late. The regret weighed heavily on her shoulders as she glanced at him once more, just as he stood up to prepare for landing. The billionaire, however, seemed unfazed. He stood with ease, collected his things, and walked calmly toward the front of the plane, completely composed. It was almost as if the entire exchange had never happened. But to the flight attendant, it was a stark reminder that sometimes the biggest mistakes weren't the ones that caused the most immediate damage. They were the ones that happened when you failed to see the whole picture, when you judged someone based on nothing but a first glance. She couldn't stop replaying the moment in her mind, the moment she had wrongly assumed he didn't belong in the first-class cabin. It was the moment that would stay with her long after the flight was over, a reminder that people were more than what they appeared to be. And that sometimes, you had to look beyond the surface to truly understand who someone was. As the plane touched down, the tension that had lingered throughout the flight slowly began to dissipate. Passengers started to gather their belongings, preparing to disembark, and the flight attendants resumed their routine, moving through the cabin to help with the final preparations. But for the younger flight attendant, the weight of her mistake still hung over her. She had hoped that once the plane landed, she could forget about the incident. But she knew deep down she would never be able to. The billionaire had remained calm throughout the rest of the flight, keeping to himself. But as the plane came to a halt at the gate, the flight attendants prepared to guide the passengers out. The younger attendant watched him carefully from the corner of her eye, her stomach twisted in knots. He stood up from his seat and began gathering his things. As he moved down the aisle toward the exit, he walked past her without so much as a glance. But just as he was about to step into the jet bridge, he turned around. The flight attendant's heart skipped a beat. Was he coming to speak to her? Had he decided to report her to the airline? She braced herself for the worst. But then, unexpectedly, he smiled. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady and calm. "I appreciate you taking the time to fix the situation. I know it wasn't easy." The flight attendant blinked, not sure if she had heard him right. Was he thanking her? After everything that had happened, after she had made him feel so small, he was thanking her. I just wanted to say that I'm sorry for what happened," she stammered, suddenly at a loss for words. "I should have never assumed—" "Don't worry about it," he interrupted gently, his smile still in place. "You're not the first to make that mistake. Just remember, next time, don't judge a book by its cover." The word stung, but there was no malice in his tone. He wasn't angry or bitter. He seemed almost understanding. The flight attendant nodded, feeling a wave of relief wash over her, but also a deep sense of guilt for her earlier actions. She had never expected an apology from him, but this was something else. It was a lesson in humility, in seeing beyond the surface of someone, and in the importance of treating everyone with respect, no matter how they appeared. He gave her one last nod, turned and walked down the jet bridge, disappearing into the airport terminal. The flight attendant stood there for a moment, still processing what had just happened. She had been expecting him to be angry, to make her pay for her mistake. But instead, he had handled it with grace. He had taught her something without saying it outright. As the final passengers disembarked, the younger flight attendant couldn't shake the feeling that she had just been given a second chance, a chance to learn from her mistake and do better next time. It wasn't just about the flight or the seating issue anymore. It was about understanding people, about seeing beyond the surface, and about never making assumptions again. She stood there for a moment longer, reflecting on the encounter before gathering herself and moving toward the crew area. The rest of the crew had already gathered there, discussing the flight, but she wasn't ready to join in just yet. She needed a moment to process everything. The lesson she had learned that day wasn't just about a mistaken seat assignment. It was about the bigger picture, about how people were far more complex than what they appeared to be. And as she walked toward the crew room, she couldn't help but think about the billionaire's final words. "Don't judge a book by its cover." It was a simple phrase, but it was one she would carry with her for a long time. The next few days after the flight were a blur for the younger flight attendant. She went about her duties as usual, but she couldn't stop thinking about the encounter with the billionaire. The more she thought about it, the more she realized how deeply her assumptions had shaped her actions. She had judged him based on nothing more than his clothes and demeanor. And yet, he had proven to be something entirely different, something much bigger than she had imagined. Her colleagues noticed that something was off. She was quieter than usual, lost in thought during crew briefings and training sessions. One of the senior flight attendants, a woman who had been working for years, pulled her aside after a particularly quiet shift. "You're a little distant today. Everything all right?" she asked, her voice soft but concerned. The younger flight attendant hesitated, unsure if she wanted to share the story. But eventually, she found herself telling her colleague everything: the seating mix-up, the billionaire, the awkward apology, and the unexpected words he had shared with her. When she finished, she took a deep breath, waiting for the judgment she was sure would come. To her surprise, her colleague didn't scold her or even seem shocked. Instead, she nodded thoughtfully. "You know, that's happened to a lot of us," the senior flight attendant said, her voice understanding. "We sometimes make assumptions about people, especially on flights. It's easy to do, especially when you're tired or rushed. But it's always good to remember that everyone has a story we don't know." The younger flight attendant felt a weight lift off her chest. For the first time, she didn't feel alone in her mistake. She paused, struggling to find the right words. "I didn't even think about who he could be. I just assumed." "Yeah, we all do," her colleague said, offering a reassuring smile. "But it's what you do after that matters. You learned from it. And I think that's what he wanted you to see." Her colleague's words stuck with her. She had learned something important, but she wasn't sure if she was ready to completely let go of the guilt. She still felt a sting when she thought about how she had treated him, how easy it was to dismiss someone based on how they looked. But slowly, over the next few days, the weight of the mistake began to lift. With time, she started to carry herself differently. She paid closer attention to the way she interacted with passengers, reminding herself not to make snap judgments. She began to approach every situation with a little more curiosity, a little more patience. And each time she did, she felt a little more confident that she was doing the right thing. A couple of weeks later, she was working another flight, this time in a different section of the plane. As she moved down the aisle, handing out drinks and snacks, she caught sight of a passenger who looked a little out of place. He was dressed in casual clothes, wearing a hoodie and jeans, much like the billionaire had been. For a moment, the old habit kicked in, the one where she might have assumed he didn't belong. But instead of rushing to judge him, she took a step back. She offered him a polite smile and asked if he needed anything. As the flight continued, she watched him interact with other passengers, quiet, unassuming, and friendly. Nothing about him screamed important or wealthy, but something told her that there was more to him than met the eye. She realized that she would never know for sure, and that was okay. What mattered was how she treated him in that moment. And in that moment, she chose to treat him with respect, just as she would anyone else. That small act of kindness, that shift in her mindset, felt like progress. She realized that she didn't need to know someone's background or status to treat them with dignity. She didn't need to see their title or their wealth to understand that everyone deserved the same level of respect. And it felt good. It felt right. By the time the flight landed, the younger flight attendant had already made up her mind. She wouldn't let her past mistake define her. She wouldn't let it make her bitter or cynical. Instead, she would let it be the lesson that shaped her approach to every passenger she met in the future. The billionaire's words had stuck with her. Don't judge a book by its cover. And with that lesson in mind, she would approach every new encounter with an open mind, ready to see people for who they truly were, not just for what they seemed to be. It wasn't long before the younger flight attendant's world collided with that of the billionaire again, though she had no idea it would happen. Several months had passed since that fateful flight, and she had worked hard to leave the mistake behind her, focusing on being a better, more thoughtful crew member. The incident with the billionaire had been a wake-up call, but life, as it often does, moved on. She had no expectation of ever seeing him again. After all, he was one of the most powerful men in the world, hardly someone likely to cross paths with her again. But fate had other plans. One bright morning, she found herself working another flight to a major city. As she walked down the aisle during boarding, helping passengers stow their luggage, she noticed something familiar. A figure in the front of the line caught her eye. Tall, confident, and unmistakably dressed in casual clothes. A black hoodie, jeans, sneakers. Her heart skipped a beat. It was him, the billionaire, Richard Lawson. For a moment she froze, unsure of how to react. Her first instinct was to walk right past him, pretend like she didn't recognize him. After all, how could she face him after everything that had happened? But then she remembered the lessons she'd learned. The mistake she had made months ago wasn't a reflection of who she was now. She had changed. She had learned. And if this was the moment to prove that to herself, then so be it. With a deep breath, she walked up to him, a little hesitant but determined to show him that she had grown. "Mr. Lawson," she said, her voice steady, but with a note of caution. "It's good to see you again. I just wanted to apologize again for how I treated you last time. I made a big mistake and I regret it." Richard looked up at her, and for a second, she saw the same calm, almost distant expression from their last encounter. But this time, there was something different in his eyes. He seemed less guarded, more relaxed. After a long pause, he smiled. "You don't need to apologize," he said, his voice warm. "I didn't hold it against you. Everyone makes mistakes." His words took her by surprise. For a moment, she had braced herself for a cold reception, perhaps even for him to remind her of how wrong she had been. Instead, he was treating her with the same level of calm that he had shown her before. "I'm glad to see that you've been doing well," he added, his eyes flicking to her uniform. "It seems like you've learned a lot from that experience." The flight attendant nodded, feeling a weight lift off her shoulders. She was surprised by how much his words meant to her. They weren't just a reassured, "It's okay." They felt like an acknowledgement that she had truly grown from the situation. He wasn't offering her just forgiveness. He was giving her something even more valuable, a chance to show that she could learn from her mistakes and make things right. "I have," she said, a smile slowly spreading across her face. "Thank you for saying that. I really appreciate it." Richard gave a small nod before turning to stow his bag in the overhead compartment. As he settled into his seat, the flight attendant returned to her duties, but she couldn't help but feel lighter. The awkwardness she had expected, the discomfort of facing him again, had melted away. Throughout the flight, she couldn't stop thinking about the brief exchange. Richard Lawson had shown her something powerful with his reaction. Forgiveness, yes, but also understanding. It had been a mistake, and he could have let that define their future interactions. But instead, he chose to let it go. He had moved past it, and in doing so, he had offered her the chance to do the same. As the flight continued, she went about her duties with a renewed sense of purpose. The experience with Richard Lawson had come full circle. What had started as an embarrassing moment, one that she thought would haunt her forever, had turned into an opportunity for growth. She had learned the value of treating every person with respect, no matter their appearance or background, and she had learned to own up to her mistakes. By the time the plane landed, she had made peace with herself. She had faced the person she had wronged and had made things right. And while she knew that life would always present challenges, she also knew that this lesson, the lesson of seeing beyond the surface, was one she would carry with her for the rest of her career. As she walked down the jet bridge after the flight, she smiled to herself, feeling proud. She wasn't the same person who had made that mistake months ago, and thanks to Richard Lawson, she was better for it. The days following that flight felt different for the younger flight attendant. The encounter with Richard Lawson had left a mark on her, but not in the way she had expected. She thought the experience would linger as a reminder of her mistake, but instead, it became something far more profound, a catalyst for change not just in her own behavior, but in the way she saw the world and the people around her. The lesson she had learned from him wasn't just about judgment, it was about growth and humility. She realized that her role as a flight attendant was more than just providing service. It was about connecting with people, understanding them beyond the surface, and treating everyone with the same dignity, regardless of their appearance or status. It had been easy to get caught up in assumptions, especially in a job where people come and go so quickly. But now, she made a conscious effort to stop and truly listen to her passengers, to see them for who they were, not for how they looked or how they dressed. Her colleagues began to notice the change too. She was more engaged during briefings, more patient with passengers, and most importantly, more present. One day, during a routine flight, an older colleague pulled her aside after a particularly busy shift. "You've been different lately," the senior attendant said, her tone light but curious. "What's going on with you? You're calmer, more in tune with things." The younger flight attendant smiled, her thoughts immediately drifting to the conversation she had with Richard Lawson. "I think I've just been thinking a lot about how we see people," she said. "I used to rush to judgments without realizing it. But I've learned that it's not enough to just go by what we see on the surface. People are more than that, and I want to make sure I remember that every day." Her colleague nodded thoughtfully, a knowing smile on her face. "That's a good way to think, and it shows. I've seen the way you handle passengers now. You're more patient with them, more understanding. It's a good thing." It wasn't just her colleagues who noticed the change. Passengers too seemed to respond differently. On one flight, a young family boarded and the mother seemed particularly stressed, juggling a crying baby and an overstuffed diaper bag. In the past, the flight attendant might have rushed to help, but in a detached, let's get this over with way. But today she took a moment to pause. She knelt down to the child's level, offering a soft smile and some reassuring words to the mother. "Don't worry, we'll take care of everything," she said, her tone warm and sincere. "We'll make sure you're comfortable." The mother, visibly relieved, thanked her multiple times as the flight attendant helped her settle in. It wasn't the kind of interaction that would make headlines or become a story worth telling, but it was a moment of genuine connection, the kind of connection that came from seeing people as more than just passengers. It was that same sense of respect and empathy she had learned to give after her encounter with Richard Lawson. The change wasn't always easy. There were still moments when she was tempted to make a snap judgment, to fall back on old habits of assuming who someone was based on how they looked. But each time that urge surfaced, she reminded herself of that flight, of the billionaire who had taught her that appearances could be deceiving. She reminded herself that every person had a story, a history, and experiences that she could never fully understand just by looking at them. One day, a couple of weeks later, she was working a flight with a new team of flight attendants. As they prepped for the flight, the captain casually mentioned that they had some VIP passengers on board, but no one mentioned any names. The flight attendant paid little attention, used to hearing about high-profile passengers who were usually too busy to interact much. But as the flight progressed, she noticed a familiar face in business class, a man who had been sitting quietly by the window, reading a book. Her heart skipped a beat as she realized who it was. It was Richard Lawson again. But this time the situation felt different. She wasn't nervous or embarrassed. She wasn't worried about having made a mistake. Instead, she approached him as she would any other passenger, asking if he needed anything with a genuine smile. "Mr. Lawson, is there anything I can get you?" she asked, her voice calm and confident. He looked up from his book and smiled at her, the same warm, kind smile that had made her feel at ease the last time they'd met. "No, I'm good, thank you." They exchanged a few polite words, nothing too significant, but there was an unspoken understanding between them. This time she didn't feel the weight of her past mistake. There was no awkwardness, no lingering regret. In that moment she realized how far she had come since that first flight. She had learned to see beyond the surface, to treat everyone with respect, and to acknowledge her mistakes when they happened. Richard Lawson had, unknowingly, set in motion a chain of events that had changed the way she approached her work and the way she saw herself. And as she moved about the cabin, she couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of pride. She had learned something invaluable from the billionaire, something that went far beyond the confines of her job. She had learned to see the humanity in others, to never underestimate anyone, and to always give people the chance to show who they truly were. And maybe, just maybe, that was the real lesson. Not just to never judge a book by its cover, but to always be open to the unexpected and to the growth that came from it. Several months had passed since the flight attendant's last interaction with Richard Lawson, but his presence still lingered in her mind. She had carried the lessons from that brief encounter with her every day, shaping the way she interacted with people. And she often found herself reflecting on how one moment, one mistake, had changed her entire approach to life and work. She had become more mindful of her judgments, more patient with the people she met, and more confident in herself. But fate wasn't done with her yet. It was a late evening flight, and the cabin was relatively quiet. The typical buzz of activity had died down as passengers settled in for the long journey ahead. As she moved down the aisle to check on the passengers, a familiar face caught her eye. At first, she couldn't place it. But as she walked closer, the recognition hit her like a wave. It was Richard Lawson. This time, though, things felt different. There was no awkwardness, no tension. She had moved past that moment, and so had he. He looked the same, casual, calm, and composed. He was reading a book, completely unaware of her presence as she approached. For a brief moment, she hesitated. She could have kept walking, treated him like any other passenger, and carried on with her duties as usual. But something inside her urged her to stop. The lessons he had unknowingly taught her had stuck, and she couldn't just move past him without acknowledging the impact he had had on her life. She stopped by his seat and smiled. "Mr. Lawson," she said softly. He looked up, his eyes meeting hers with a flicker of recognition. A smile spread across his face, and there was a warmth in his expression that made her feel at ease, just like the first time they had spoken. "Good evening," he replied. "I see we meet again." She nodded, feeling a sense of calm wash over her. "Yes, we do. I just wanted to thank you again for your kindness the last time we flew together. I've been reflecting on it a lot, and it's really helped me grow as a person. You've had a bigger impact on me than you probably realize." Richard seemed genuinely surprised, but his smile only widened. "I'm glad to hear that. But you're the one who did the work. It's not every day I meet someone who can take something like that and turn it into a positive change. It's a rare quality, and I respect that." The flight attendant felt a warmth spread through her chest. Hearing him acknowledge her growth, not as a mistake she had made, but as something that had shaped her for the better, was something she hadn't expected. It was validation, not just of her professional growth, but of her personal transformation. "I've been trying to be more mindful," she said, her voice steady now, the uncertainty she had once felt replaced by a newfound confidence. "I've learned to treat everyone with more empathy, and it's made all the difference, so thank you." Richard gave a small nod, his eyes thoughtful. It's good to hear that. Empathy goes a long way, especially in a job like yours. People don't always realize how much the small things matter. But you do. Keep it up." The flight attendant smiled, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. "I will. I promise." For a few moments they exchanged pleasantries, nothing too personal, just a simple acknowledgement of the journey they had both been on, though in very different ways. As she moved on to the rest of the cabin, she felt a quiet pride in herself. Her encounter with Richard Lawson had started as an embarrassing moment of judgment and misunderstanding, but it had transformed into something far more meaningful. What had seemed like a mistake had turned into a lesson in humility, respect, and growth. And now, seeing him again, she realized that the impact of that lesson had far exceeded anything she had initially expected. She wasn't just a flight attendant anymore. She was someone who saw the world with more open eyes, more willing to embrace the complexities of others. And as she walked down the aisle, she knew that she would carry that lesson with her forever, no matter where life took her. By the time the flight landed, the younger flight attendant felt a sense of peace she hadn't known before. The past was behind her, and the future was full of possibilities that she now saw with new eyes. Thanks to Richard Lawson, she had learned that people were more than their appearances, and that mistakes were simply opportunities to grow. And with that, she felt ready to face whatever came next with a clear heart and an open mind. The flight attendant's life began to shift in small yet meaningful ways after her encounter with Richard Lawson. The changes in her were subtle at first, an increased sense of patience, a deeper empathy for the passengers she encountered, and a quiet confidence that had replaced the self-doubt she'd once carried. She found herself more engaged in conversations, more thoughtful in her interactions, and more willing to see beyond the surface of each person she met. It was as if a light had switched on in her mind, and every moment now seemed to carry more weight. Whether she was assisting a tired mother with her child, offering a kind word to a nervous first-time flyer, or simply listening to a passenger who wanted to talk, she felt more connected to the people around her. She no longer saw them as just passengers, but as individuals with stories, dreams, and struggles of their own, just like her. A few weeks after that flight with Richard, the young flight attendant was assigned to another route, this time a long-haul flight that took her overseas. The journey was uneventful at first, just like any other. She moved through the cabin with practiced ease, checking in with passengers, offering snacks and making sure everyone was comfortable. But as the plane neared its destination, something unexpected happened. A passenger in first class, an older man traveling alone, asked her to come to his seat. He seemed a little agitated, but she approached him with her usual calm, her mind already anticipating the routine request for a drink or assistance with his seat. But as she arrived at his side, he spoke in a low, hurried tone. "Excuse me, miss, I hate to bother you, but I think I left something in my carry-on up there. I've been thinking about it for the past hour, and I'm not sure I can go another minute without it." It wasn't an unusual request, but there was something in his voice, an underlying anxiety, that made the flight attendant pause for a moment. He wasn't just asking for a personal item. He seemed distressed. Something told her that there was more to this than just misplaced luggage. She knelt beside him, offering a reassuring smile. "It's no trouble at all, sir. I'll go check for you right away." She made her way up to the front of the cabin, where the carry-ons were stowed. As she reached the storage compartment, she heard the soft sound of a sob. She turned, surprised to find the older man's bag tucked in a corner. The sobbing sound continued, and as she opened the bag, she found the source, a small, well-worn photo album. It was clear the man hadn't just forgotten his bag, he had forgotten the album, something far more meaningful to him. She returned to his seat, the album in hand, and when she placed it in his lap, his eyes immediately filled with tears. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "I thought I'd lost the last remaining memories of my late wife. This album, it's all I have left of her." The flight attendant sat down beside him, giving him the space to collect himself. She could see the pain in his eyes, the loss that he carried with him every day. She didn't need to say anything. Words felt unnecessary. Instead, she sat with him for a moment, silently offering her support. "Take your time, sir," she said softly. "We're almost there, and I'll be here if you need anything." As the man quietly flipped through the pages of the album, the flight attendant couldn't help but reflect on the moment. It wasn't about the service she was providing. It was about being present, understanding that sometimes people don't need anything other than someone who will sit with them through their pain, without judgment or hurry. This was the true lesson that Richard Lawson's encounter had sparked in her. She had learned that service wasn't just about checking off tasks or meeting needs. It was about human connection. It was about seeing beyond the surface of the job and offering something more meaningful, something real. By the time the plane touched down, the older man had regained his composure. He thanked her once more, but this time his smile was genuine, his eyes clearer. "You've been more help than you know," he said. "I'm not sure what I would have done without you." As the flight attendant watched him leave the plane, she couldn't help but smile. She had made a difference, a real connection with that simple act. The lesson she had learned from Richard Lawson had given her the strength to step beyond the role of flight attendant and into the role of someone who could offer genuine human support. That moment, with the older man and his treasured memories, felt like a turning point. The connection she had made was small in the grand scheme of things, but it was powerful. And as she walked back toward the galley, she realized something important. The work she did every day, the way she treated people, had the potential to ripple out and affect more lives than she could ever know. In the end, it wasn't the grand gestures or the big moments that mattered most. It was the quiet, unspoken connections, the ones that happened when you looked past the surface and saw the person beneath. And as the flight attendant prepared for her next journey, she knew she was ready for whatever came next, with a heart open to the possibility of making a difference, one person at a time. Months had gone by since the flight attendant had seen Richard Lawson last, and while she had carried his lesson with her every day, life on the job continued to present its own challenges and rewards. The busy seasons came and went, each flight filled with new faces and stories. Yet, through it all, the lesson remained. The reminder to treat everyone with respect, to see beyond the surface, and to understand that everyone had their own journey. She had embraced this newfound perspective, and it had made her a better, more grounded person, both on and off the job. But as the holidays approached, she found herself back on a flight to the city where Richard Lawson was based. The thought of him popped into her mind now and then, not with any expectation of seeing him again, but simply as a reflection of the growth she had experienced. She often wondered how he was doing, if he was still leading his company with the same quiet confidence, and if he ever thought about their brief encounter. This particular flight was crowded, as expected during the holiday rush. Passengers were in high spirits, eager to get home for the holidays, and the flight attendant was doing what she had done countless times before, greeting, serving, and ensuring everyone's comfort. But as she moved down the aisle to offer drinks, something caught her eye. A familiar face sitting in business class, staring out of the window. It was Richard Lawson. Her heart skipped a beat. For a moment she wondered if it was a coincidence, if she was imagining it. But as she drew closer, her eyes locked with his, and she recognized the calm, unassuming gaze that had greeted her so many months ago. Richard smiled when he saw her, that same warm, knowing smile that instantly put her at ease. The flight attendant paused in the aisle, unsure whether to approach. But this time, she didn't hesitate. She walked up to him, a sense of purpose filling her chest. "Mr. Lawson," she said, her voice steady and sincere. "Ah, we meet again," he replied, his smile never fading. "It's good to see you." She nodded, a little surprised at how natural it felt to be standing in front of him again. This time it wasn't the awkwardness of an earlier mistake hanging between them. It was simply two people who had shared a moment of growth, an exchange that had left an imprint on both of their lives. "I never expected to see you again," she said, her words coming out more like a confession than a simple observation. "But I've thought about that moment we had, about how much it taught me. I just wanted to thank you again for what you said to me. It really made a difference." Richard leaned back in his seat, nodding thoughtfully. "I'm glad to hear that. I always think about how little moments can have such a big impact, even if we don't realize it at the time." "That's exactly it," she agreed. "It was a mistake at first, but I've carried it with me. It's shaped how I see people, how I treat them. I've learned so much from that encounter." He looked at her, his gaze soft but serious. "Sometimes, it's the smallest interactions that teach us the most. I'm glad I could help you see that." For a moment, neither of them said anything. There was a shared understanding, a quiet appreciation for the journey they had each taken since their first encounter. The flight attendant felt a rush of gratitude, not just for the chance to speak to him again, but for the realization that, through this seemingly insignificant exchange, she had learned to see herself and others differently. She had become someone who didn't just serve passengers, but someone who genuinely tried to understand them, who treated each person as an individual with their own story. And in doing so, she had found a deeper purpose in her work. "I've become a better person because of that lesson," she said, almost to herself. "And I think you helped me find that." Richard nodded again, his expression thoughtful. "You did the work. You took what I said to heart, and that's what matters. I'm just glad I could play a small part in that." The conversation was brief, but it felt significant. There was no more awkwardness, no lingering resentment over past mistakes, just a sense of mutual respect. After a few more words, the flight attendant excused herself, but not before Richard thanked her again for the service she was providing. It wasn't just a casual thanks. It was the kind of gratitude that reflected the understanding they both shared about the importance of treating others with respect. As she moved on to the next row, she couldn't help but smile to herself. The past year had been full of challenges, moments of self-doubt and hard lessons, but she had emerged from it stronger, wiser, and more compassionate than ever. She had become someone who didn't just provide a service. She became someone who connected with people on a deeper level, who saw beyond their appearances and understood their humanity. And that, she realized, was the true power of a second chance. Not just in the eyes of others, but in her own eyes, giving herself the opportunity to learn, to grow, and to move forward, no matter what mistakes she had made along the way. As the plane soared through the sky, she felt a deep sense of peace. She had come full circle. She had learned to appreciate the beauty of both the small moments and the big lessons, knowing that both would continue to shape her journey, one flight at a time. The flight attendant couldn't help but reflect on how much had changed in her life since that first, seemingly insignificant encounter with Richard Lawson. She had seen countless faces and heard even more stories, but there was something about that moment. A mistake, a misunderstanding followed by an unexpected apology, that had shaped everything for her. It wasn't just about him or his position in the world, but the way his actions had ignited a shift within her. His calm, forgiving nature had taught her to approach life with more patience, more understanding, and more humility. As the holiday season drew closer, she found herself growing more reflective. She had always enjoyed the festive hustle and bustle of the season, the smiles and the shared moments of kindness among passengers. But this year, she noticed something different in herself. She wasn't just going through the motions, offering her usual polite greetings and assistance. She was more present, more aware of the little exchanges, the small gestures of kindness that too often went unnoticed. A warm smile from a tired parent, a quiet thank you from an elderly traveler, a shared laugh with a nervous flyer. All of it meant something to her now. One afternoon, as she was preparing for yet another flight during the busiest travel period of the year, she overheard a conversation between two fellow flight attendants. They were discussing a difficult passenger, a man who had been demanding, rude, and critical from the moment he boarded. He had made several complaints, each one more unreasonable than the last. His frustration was palpable, and it was clear that he wasn't going to make the flight easy for anyone. The younger flight attendant listened for a moment, then walked over to join the conversation. "I'll take care of him," she said, her voice calm but firm. Her colleagues exchanged a glance, unsure at first. It wasn't easy dealing with a passenger like that, especially not one who seemed determined to be difficult. But the flight attendant's calm resolve surprised them. She made her way down the aisle to where the man was seated, already scribbling on a notepad, muttering complaints to himself. As she approached, he looked up, his face twisted in annoyance. "Can I help you, sir?" she asked politely, keeping her voice steady but warm. She noticed the tightness in his shoulders, the tension in his eyes. He didn't look at her, but instead grumbled in response. "I need to know why the seat reclines so much," he snapped, pointing toward the seat in front of him. "It's uncomfortable. I can't stand this." The flight attendant took a breath, remembering what she had learned from Richard's forgiveness and how he had treated her with patience when she had made a mistake. She didn't let his frustration affect her. Instead, she knelt down beside his seat, her tone calm and reassuring. "I understand that you're uncomfortable, sir. I'll be happy to help adjust the seat for you," she said. "But I also want to let you know that we're doing everything we can to ensure everyone's comfort. If you're still having trouble, I'll make sure we address it again once we're airborne." The man looked at her for a long moment, sizing her up, probably expecting her to react with frustration or defensiveness. But her calmness seemed to disarm him. His posture softened just a little. "All right," he muttered almost grudgingly. "Just make sure it gets fixed." "I will, sir," she said with a smile. "Thank you for your patience." As she walked away, she felt a small but important sense of accomplishment. The man had not been kind or even particularly polite, but instead of letting his behavior dictate hers, she had treated him with the same respect she'd been working hard to offer everyone. It wasn't about letting him walk all over her. It was about not letting his bad attitude influence her own actions. As the flight continued, the atmosphere on board was noticeably more relaxed. The man, who had been tense and irritated at the start, seemed to settle into his seat, no longer causing any more trouble. It wasn't a dramatic shift, but it was a sign that when you approach others with patience and understanding, even in the face of negativity, it can make a difference, even if it's just a small one. Later in the flight, as the passengers were preparing for landing, the man approached her again, this time with a softer expression. "I just wanted to say thank you," he said, his tone far less harsh than before. "I appreciate you handling the situation with respect. It's not easy dealing with people like me." The flight attendant smiled, her heart light. "I understand, sir. Everyone has their moments, and we all just want to get through the flight comfortably. I'm glad I could help." He nodded, his gaze shifting away as the plane began its descent. The flight attendant went about her duties, feeling a quiet satisfaction. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was a moment of connection, a small win for empathy and patience in a world that often lacked both. She knew that it was these moments that would add up over time, shaping her not just as a flight attendant, but as a person who chose to see the best in others. As the plane touched down and passengers began to disembark, the flight attendant thought back to her encounter with Richard. She had come a long way since then. She was no longer the woman who had made the snap judgment, who had been quick to dismiss someone based on what she saw on the outside. She was someone who understood the importance of looking beyond the surface, of treating everyone with the same level of respect, regardless of how they appeared. In her heart, she knew that the impact of those lessons would stay with her for the rest of her life, continuing to shape her interactions with people for years to come. The ripple effect of that one moment, when she had misjudged Richard Lawson, and then learned to see him for who he truly was, had created a lasting change in her. And in that, she had found something far more valuable than anything she could have imagined. A deeper connection to the world around her, one person at a time. She was no longer just a flight attendant. She was someone who believed in second chances, and who believed that a single moment could change everything. As the weeks turned into months, the flight attendant found herself reflecting on just how far she had come. She had learned to look beyond the surface of people, to treat each passenger as a unique individual, and to approach every interaction with a sense of empathy and patience. The lessons that started with her encounter with Richard Lawson had taken root deeply within her, and now they shaped how she saw the world and how she saw herself. The airline had become more than just a job. It had become a space where she could practice kindness, where every flight was an opportunity to make a difference, no matter how small. She had always loved helping people, but now it felt different. She wasn't just providing a service, she was offering something much more meaningful, a moment of connection, a kind word when someone was having a tough day, or a listening ear when a passenger needed to talk. One evening, while on a layover in a quiet airport lounge, she received a letter from the airline. It was an official company notice, and at first, she thought it was just another routine communication. But as she opened it, her eyes widened. The letter was from a passenger who had recently flown on one of her flights, a passenger who had been seated in the back of the plane during the holiday rush. The letter read, "I wanted to write to you and thank you for the kindness you showed me during my flight. I know I wasn't the easiest passenger. I had a lot of baggage, both literally and emotionally. But you took the time to speak to me, to treat me like I mattered. You didn't just do your job, you made me feel seen. I haven't felt that in a long time, and I wanted you to know how much it meant to me." The letter went on to describe how the flight attendant's calm presence and understanding had helped the passenger through a difficult flight. The passenger had been dealing with a personal loss, and the simple kindness shown to him had made the flight more bearable. By the end of the letter, the passenger had thanked her again for her empathy and care. As the flight attendant read through the letter, her eyes welled up with tears. This wasn't the first time someone had thanked her for her service, but there was something different about this letter. It wasn't about the drink she had served or the efficiency with which she had carried out her duties. It was about the impact she had made by simply being present, by choosing kindness and understanding when it mattered most. In that moment, the flight attendant realized something that filled her with a deep sense of fulfillment. The lesson she had learned from Richard Lawson had come full circle. The lesson wasn't just about treating people with respect. It was about the power of human connection, about recognizing that every person you meet has a story, and sometimes all they need is someone who will take the time to listen, to understand, and to care. She thought back to the first time she had met Richard, how she had misjudged him, assuming he didn't belong in business class. She had made that mistake not just because of how he looked, but because she hadn't taken the time to really see him. But through her own mistake, she had learned to see people, really see them, and it had changed everything. It had changed how she interacted with passengers, how she viewed her role in the world, and how she thought about her own purpose in life. Now, years later, she was part of something bigger than herself. She had become a person who left behind more than just a seatbelt sign or a meal tray. She had become someone who left behind a legacy of kindness, a ripple effect of compassion that spread throughout every person she interacted with. Each smile, each word of comfort, each small act of understanding was her way of passing on the lesson Richard Lawson had unknowingly given her. And as she thought about all the passengers she had met over the years, all the lives she had touched, she felt a deep sense of gratitude. The work she did was no longer just a job. It was a calling, a chance to make the world a little kinder, one flight at a time. The flight attendant smiled to herself as she folded the letter, placing it carefully in her bag. She wasn't sure when or if she would ever see Richard Lawson again, but she didn't need to. The impact he had had on her life had already done its work. She had become a better person because of that one encounter, and in turn, she had helped others become better versions of themselves. And that, she knew, was the true power of kindness. The kind that stays with you long after the moment has passed, changing not just the people you meet, but the world itself. As she prepared for her next flight, the final thought that crossed her mind was simple but profound. This was just the beginning. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to like this video, Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe to the channel for more amazing stories like this.